Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Today, I'm telling you a love story so raw, it bleeds so stubborn, it refuses to die born in the cruelest winter the Chiricahua Mountains ever knew. Where snow buries hope and soldiers hunt shadows, and a single glance can change who lives and who fades into the ground. It starts with a man who could have chosen anyone, and instead knelt in front of the woman everyone had already forgotten. One heartbeat, one refusal of the expected path. And from that single act of quiet defiance grew something the whole band would either follow or be forced to bury. The late winter sun hung low and thin over the Chiricahua Mountains, bleeding pale light across the narrow canyon. A cold wind knifed down from the high ridges, rattling the ponderosa pines and carrying the sharp, resinous smell of their needles. The small band of Chiricahua had stopped here only hours earlier, wagons of hides and blankets dragged behind weary horses, children too tired to cry anymore, old women clutching blankets around their shoulders like armor. They worked in near silence, raising the wickiup frames with practiced mechanical motions. Fires were already lit, small and stingy, their smoke rising straight up before the wind tore it apart. Everyone felt it, the weight of something unfinished. Bonito stood apart from the others, arms folded across his scarred chest, his dark eyes sweeping the camp without hurry. 5 winters had passed since he last spoke of taking a wife. 5 winters the elders had watched him refuse every suggestion, every quiet nudge toward Tessa the chief's niece, whose beauty was spoken of even by the old women who had no reason to care about such things. Tessa stood now in the center of the gathering circle, her deerskin dress embroidered with the careful beadwork of someone who knew her worth would be measured tonight. She held her chin high, but her fingers betrayed her twisting the fringe at her hip until the leather creaked. The elders had gathered the eligible women in a loose half-moon. They waited. The wind waited. Even the horses stood still, heads low, ears flicking at every snap of branch. Bonito moved. He walked slowly, boots crunching the thin crust of snow. No one spoke. Each step he took past a woman, past the daughters of warriors, past girls, whose laughter had once followed him like summer thunder, was another small wound to the families watching. Tessa's shoulders stiffened when he passed without pause. She did not look away, but her mouth tightened into a line so thin it might have been drawn with charcoal. He stopped. Not in front of Tessa. Not in front of any of the women the camp had already chosen in their minds. He stopped before Ita. She was crouched near the woodpile, half hidden by the stacked branches she had carried in armloads all afternoon. Her hands, small, chapped, smudged with ash, were busy feeding twigs into a struggling fire. She had not looked up when the circle formed. She never did. Her hair fell forward like a curtain, hiding the limp she tried so hard to conceal, hiding the way her left leg turned inward when she stood too long. Bonito's shadow fell across her. She froze. Slowly she lifted her face. Her eyes were wide, dark, startled like a deer that has just realized the hunter is not aiming past it. Her fingers tightened around the stick she held until the wood cracked softly. The wind chose that moment to gust hard, whipping snow dust across the canyon floor. Bonito's voice cut through it, low and steady, carrying to every ear in the camp. "I want you in my lodge." A ripple of breath moved through the people, sharp, almost painful. "I will provide for you. I will protect you. I will honor you above all others." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. They spread outward, rippling, touching every face. Ita's mouth opened, but no sound came at first. Her chest rose and fell too fast. The stick in her hand trembled so violently the fire sputtered. "I cannot—" Her voice was barely a whisper, thin as winter smoke. I will burden you." She looked down again, as though the words had shamed her into disappearing. Her shoulders curved inward. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks upward. Bonito did not move. He sank slowly to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. The motion was deliberate, unhurried. Snowflakes caught in his hair and melted against his skin without him seeming to notice. He did not speak again. He simply waited. Around them, the camp held its breath. Tessa's hands fell still at her sides. One of the elder's old iron shifted his weight, the beads on his shirt clicking once. Somewhere a horse snorted, uneasy. The wind rose again, colder now, carrying the faint, distant smell of wood smoke from another canyon, another band perhaps running from the same soldiers who never seemed to tire. It was a smell that reminded everyone how thin the margin was between living and not. Ita's gaze lifted once more. Tears stood bright in her eyes, but she did not blink them away. Her lips moved without sound, forming the shape of another refusal she could not quite speak. Bonito remained on his knee, unmoving, his scarred hands resting open on his thighs. The silence stretched one heartbeat, 2, 3, until it felt like the canyon itself was listening. Then Ita's shoulders sagged just a fraction. She nodded once, small, almost invisible. The wind answered with a long, low moan through the pines. No one cheered. No one spoke. Only the fire crackled greedy for the next twig she would never feed it. Bonito rose. He offered his hand. Ita stared at it a long moment, calloused palm, old knife scars steady. She did not take it. Instead, she stood on her own, slowly, painfully favoring her bad leg. When she was upright, she looked at him again, eyes searching his face for the joke, the mistake the moment he would laugh and turn away. He did not. He simply turned and walked toward the wickiup that had been prepared his wickiup, knowing she would follow. She did. Behind them, the camp remained frozen a heartbeat longer. Then, one by one, the people turned back to their tasks, feeding fires, tying hides, speaking in murmurs too low to carry. But the wind kept blowing, and somewhere far down the canyon, faint as a memory, came the sound of a single rifle shot, distant, flat, final. No one looked toward it. The wickiup smelled of fresh-cut willow and damp hides, the kind of scent that clung to the back of your throat and reminded you how far from summer you were. A small fire burned in the center pit, no bigger than a man's 2 hands cupped together. Its light flickered low and uncertain, throwing long shadows across the curved walls and catching on the rough poles overhead. 2 sleeping robes of thick buffalo hide lay at opposite ends of the small space, one near the entrance flap, one against the far curve of the lodge. Between them stretched an empty stretch of packed earth that felt wider than the canyon outside. Bonito sat cross-legged near his robe, back straight hands, resting loose on his knees. He had not spoken since they entered. The fire popped once, sending a spark spiraling upward toward the smoke hole. It died before it reached the night. Ita stood just inside the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself, as though the cold had followed her in. Her bad leg trembled under the weight of standing still too long. She kept her eyes on the fire, not daring to look at the man who had just claimed her in front of everyone she had ever known. The words he had spoken in the circle still rang in her ears, clear, steady, impossible. She felt them like stones in her stomach. Outside, voices drifted on the wind. Low, careful. Not meant to carry, but they did. Chosen wrong. She'll drag him down. What was he thinking Tessa would have strengthened us? He'll see it soon enough. The words slipped through the hide walls like smoke. Ita flinched, each time small, almost invisible movements. Her fingers dug into the wool of her blanket until the knuckles showed white. A different sound, soft footsteps on snow. They paused just outside the flap. A shadow moved across the firelight for half a heartbeat. Tessa. She did not speak, did not call out. She simply stood there close enough that Ita could smell the faint pine gum scent of her hair oil, then turned and walked away. The footsteps faded into the night. Ita's breath hitched. She pressed her lips together hard. Bonito had not moved. His gaze stayed on the flames, but she felt him watching her in the way a man watches a wounded animal, careful, patient, unwilling to startle it into bolting. She took one step forward, then stopped. The floor was cold against her bare feet. She wanted to speak, to ask why, to beg him to take it back before the whole camp laughed at him tomorrow. But the words died in her throat. Finally, Bonito spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, the way a man speaks when he knows the words might break something fragile. I chose you, not your service. He paused, letting the fire fill the silence. I will wait as long as you need. Ita stared at him. Her mouth opened-closed. No sound came. Something hot and sharp burned behind her eyes. She turned away quickly, shuffling to the far robe. She knelt awkward, her bad leg folding under her, with a small, involuntary gasp of pain. She pulled the buffalo hide over her shoulders like a shield, curling into herself, until she faced the wall of woven branches and hide. Her back was to him. Her shoulders shook once-twice, then stilled. Bonito watched the small shape under the robe. He did not move closer. He simply lay down on his own robe boots, still on knife within reach. He folded his arms behind his head and stared up through the smoke hole at the narrow circle of black sky. Stars glittered there, cold and distant. He did not sleep. Neither did she. The fire burned down to coals. The wind moaned outside, low and restless. Somewhere a dog barked once, sharp, then fell silent. The camp settled into the uneasy hush of people waiting for dawn to prove them right or wrong. When the first gray light seeped under the flap, Ita stirred. She sat up slowly, blanket falling from her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed, face pale. She did not look at Bonito. Instead, she reached for her moccasins, pulled them on with careful, hurting movements. Then she stood favoring her good leg and slipped past him toward the entrance. Bonito's eyes were open. He had not slept at all. She paused at the flap, one hand on the hide, the other clenched at her side. For a second she seemed about to speak, but she only drew a shaky breath, ducked outside, and was gone. Bonito rose in one smooth motion. He crossed to the doorway and pushed the flap aside just enough to see. She was already moving toward the woodpile, limping through the fresh snow. Her breath plumed white in the dawn air. She bent, gathered an armload of branches, more than she could comfortably carry. A thin line of blood appeared on her palm, where a sharp twig had torn the skin. She did not stop. She simply shifted the load higher against her chest and started back toward the nearest firehead, down shoulders hunched against the wind. Bonito's hand tightened on the handle of his knife, still sheathed at his belt. The knuckles went white. He could have called her back, could have taken the wood from her arms, could have told her to rest. He did none of those things. He let the flap fall closed. Inside the wickiup, the coals glowed dull red. The air smelled of smoke and wet hide, and the faint iron tang of blood. Outside, Ita kept walking, slow, stubborn bleeding into the pale winter morning. And somewhere down the canyon, faint but unmistakable, a raven called once harsh, lonely warning. Bonito stood motionless in the half-light, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade. He knew the price had only begun to be paid. The days bled into one another, each colder and hungrier than the last. 3 weeks had passed since the choosing, and the canyon had turned mean. The snow lay deeper now, crusting over like old leather, and the game trails had gone silent. What roots the women dug up came out smaller, tougher, barely worth the blisters. The children no longer ran. They shuffled eyes too big in their faces. The air tasted of pine smoke and frost, and the faint, sour edge of worry. Ita moved through it all like someone trying to disappear into the work itself. She rose before first light, limping out to the frozen stream with a wooden bucket that had once belonged to someone else's mother. The water came up black and stinging, slopping over the rim as she carried it back. Her hands cracked open in the cold. Thin red lines wept across her palms and knuckles. She wrapped them in strips of old cloth, but the cloth soaked through by midday. She did not complain. She simply kept moving. She gathered what little the earth would give, bitter roots buried under snow, the last shriveled berries clinging to low branches, strips of inner bark she boiled into a thin gruel that tasted of nothing but survival. She carried armloads of deadfall back to the fire's branches, dragging behind her like accusations. Her bad leg dragged worse with every trip, the knee swelling, until the joint felt hot and foreign under her skin. She heard the voices. They were not always whispers anymore. From the next lodge over a woman's voice, sharp meant to carry, "She'll never keep pace when we have to run." "The soldiers don't wait for cripples." Another answered lower, "But no kinder Bonito's pride will cost us all. A strong man needs a strong woman beside him." Once a young warrior, one of the ones who had stood closest to Tessa that first night, passed her as she struggled with a full bucket. He slowed just long enough to let the words drop like stones into her path. "A strong man doesn't carry dead weight," he said loud enough for the women nearby to hear. He did not look at her when he spoke. He did not need to. Ita kept her head down. Her arms shook. Water sloshed against her shins, freezing instantly into icy patches on her leggings. She set the bucket down once-twice to catch her breath, leaning hard on a tree trunk until the dizziness passed. Then she lifted it again. Bonito watched. He stood at the edge of their wiki-up arms, folded, face unreadable. He saw the blood on her hands, the way her limp had grown heavier, the way she bit her lip when the pain flared. He saw it all. He did not go to her. If he took the bucket from her arms, if he told her to stop, it would be the same as admitting he had chosen wrong. The camp would see it. The elders would see it. And the whispers would turn into something louder, something that could not be unsaid. So he stood, and he watched, and the knot in his chest pulled tighter with every step she took. The afternoon she fell was gray and windless, the kind of stillness that made every sound louder than it should be. Ita had gone to the stream again, bucket in both hands, snow crunching under her uneven gait. The path sloped gently, but today it felt steep as a mountain. Halfway back, her foot caught on a hidden root beneath the snow. The bucket tipped. Water poured out in a dark rush, soaking her moccasins, her leggings the hem of her dress. She tried to catch herself, arms windmilling, but her bad leg buckled completely. She went down hard. The bucket clattered away, rolling into a drift. Water spread across the snow in a black stain. Ita stayed on her knees a moment, hands braced breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Then she tried to rise. The leg would not hold. She collapsed again, palms slapping wet snow. Bonito was there before she could try a third time. He crossed the distance in long strides, boots punching through the crust. He dropped to one knee beside her, slid one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. He lifted her without a word. She was lighter than he expected, too light. Her body trembled against his chest, whether from cold or shame he could not tell. She turned her face into his shoulder, hiding it. A small broken sound escaped her half-sob, half-breath. He carried her through the camp. Eyes followed them. No one spoke. The young warrior who had taunted her earlier looked away. Bonito ducked into Sage's wickiup without knocking. The old woman was already stirring something over her fire. She did not startle. She simply rose, pushed aside a pile of herbs, and pointed to the low pallet of hides. He laid Ita down as gently as stone allows. She curled onto her side, at once, knees drawn up, hands tucked under her chin. Her teeth chattered. Sage knelt beside her, pressed the back of her hand to Ita's forehead, then her neck. Her fingers lingered. "Fever's high," she said quietly, burning through her fast. Bonito stood over them, hands loose at his sides, but his fingers twitched once. Sage met his eyes. Her voice dropped lower, meant only for him. "If she doesn't come through the next 3 days, she won't come through at all." The words landed flat, heavy, final. Bonito did not answer. He simply lowered himself to the ground beside the pallet. He reached out and took Ita's hand, small, cold, slick with sweat. Her fingers curled weakly around his, then slackened. He sat there, unmoving. Outside, the wind had picked up again. It slid under the lodge edges, rattling the hides, moaning low through the canyon like laughter held just behind the teeth. The camp waited, patient, merciless, for the proof of his mistake. Bonito rested his forehead against the edge of the pallet. His eyes were open, red-rimmed, dry. He did not speak. He only held on, and the wind kept laughing. The inside of Sage's wickiup was dim and close, the air thick with the smell of sage smoke, crushed willow bark, and the faint metallic tang of fever sweat. Snow fell steadily outside, muffling every sound, except the low, relentless howl of wind through the canyon cracks. It slipped under the hide walls in thin, cold fingers, making the small fire in the center pit gutter and spit. Shadows danced long across the curved poles, catching on the bundles of dried herbs hanging overhead, like forgotten prayers. Ita lay on the low pallet of hides and blankets, motionless, except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her face was flushed dark with fever, lips cracked, hair plastered to her forehead in damp strands. Her breathing rattled soft and uneven, each exhale a small, labored sound that filled the lodge more than it should. Bonito sat on the ground beside her knees, drawn up back against the wall. He had not moved in hours. His hand held hers, small, hot slack in his grip. He had not eaten since they brought her here. A bowl of thin broth Sage had pressed on him sat untouched near the fire, cooling to a skin. Sleep had not come. His eyes were open, red-rimmed, fixed on Ita's face, as though looking away might let her slip away for good. Outside, the voices had grown bolder. They drifted past the flap in snatches, carried on the wind like smoke from distant fires. Too weak. Always was. Now she's dragging him down with her. A warrior shouldn't sit vigil for someone who can't even walk straight. He'll lose everything if she dies. The elders are already talking. Bonito heard every word. Each one landed like a dull knife, not cutting deep, just grinding. Tessa came twice a day. She did not enter. She stood just outside with 2 or 3 other women, their blankets pulled tight against the cold. They looked in through the narrow gap at the flap's edge eyes that held pity, and something sharper, something satisfied. Tessa never spoke, but once she lingered longer than the others, her silhouette dark against the snow glow. When she finally turned away, her footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though she were leaving a grave. Iron passed once late on the second night. The old man's moccasins crunched the snow outside. He stopped at the doorway, stood motionless for a long minute. Bonito felt the weight of that gaze through the hide wall, steady, measuring, silent. Iron did not speak. He did not need to. The pause itself said enough. The camp was watching, waiting to see if Bonito's choice would break him before it broke the woman he had chosen. Sage moved quietly between them. She changed the wet cloths on Ita's forehead, fed sips of bitter tea through a reed, murmured low chants that sounded more like memory than medicine. She did not offer Bonito comfort. She simply worked. On the second night, when the fire had burned low and the wind screamed hardest, Sage knelt beside him. "She's fighting," the old woman whispered. "But if she lives, she won't be the same person who fell in the snow. The fever takes something, always does." Bonito did not look up. His thumb traced slow circles on the back of Ita's hand. The motion was small, unconscious. His own hand shook, just a tremor faint enough that only he felt it. A warrior who had faced rifles and knives without flinching, now trembling for the life of a woman he had known barely a month. He leaned forward close enough that his breath stirred the damp hair at her temple. "I saw Ren," once he whispered so low only Ita could have heard, if she could hear at all. Old bent alone. Everyone walked past her. "I didn't. I see you the same way. Don't leave me." His voice cracked on the last word. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands. For a moment he stayed like that, still breathing hard, then straightened again. Eyes dry, but burning. Sage watched him without comment. She added another stick to the fire. The flames caught, flared briefly, then settled back to their sullen glow. The third morning came gray and quiet. Snow had drifted against the lodge walls, sealing them in deeper silence. Bonito had not moved. His back ached from the hard ground, his legs numb, but he stayed. Ita stirred. It was small at first, a twitch of fingers in his grasp, a hitch in her breathing. Then her eyelids fluttered. They opened slowly, heavy, unfocused. She stared at the smoke-blackened ceiling for a long moment before her gaze drifted sideways and found him. Her cracked lips parted. "I failed," she rasped, the words scraped out like dry leaves. "I'm sorry." Bonito's grip tightened. His voice came rough, almost angry. "Number." He leaned closer. "You lived. That's all I need." She blinked once slow. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, tracking down her temple into her hair. She did not have the strength to wipe it away. Bonito lifted her hand to his mouth, pressed his lips to the knuckles, once brief, fierce. Then he held her gaze, unblinking. Outside, the wind had dropped. Footsteps approached, several pairs, deliberate. They stopped just beyond the flap. No one spoke. The camp waited, breath held, to see what Bonito would do now that the fever had broken, or tried to. He did not rise. He did not speak. He simply sat there, holding her hand, eyes on her face, while the snow kept falling and the canyon held its breath. And somewhere far off, faint through the quiet, came the low, distant sound of a horse's hoof striking frozen ground once, twice, then nothing. Bonito's shoulders tensed just a fraction. He did not look towards the sound. The weeks after the fever dragged on like a slow bleed. The snow refused to melt, piling higher against the wickiups until the camp felt buried under its own weight. Food stores dwindled to scraps, dried strips of venison gone tough, as leather roots boiled until they tasted only of dirt and desperation. The children moved quieter now, their games abandoned, eyes hollow. The men came back from short hunts with nothing but frostbitten fingers and the smell of failure on their clothes. Ita healed slowly, too slowly. The fever had left her thinner, her skin sallow, her bad leg stiffer than before. She no longer rushed out at dawn to haul water or drag wood. Instead, she sat near the small fire, in front of Sage's lodge legs tucked under a worn blanket, grinding roots between two flat stones. The rhythmic scrape-scrape filled the cold air, steady as a heartbeat. She worked with her head down, hair falling forward, but her hands had steadied. She showed two young women, Tessa among them, silent and watchful, how to crush the pale root of the yarrow plant, how to boil it just long enough to draw out the pain-killing oils without turning bitter. "Too long, and it sours," she said quietly one afternoon, voice still hoarse from disuse. "But right it eases the ache in bones, quiets the fire in a wound." The girls nodded, mimicking her motions. Tessa's fingers hesitated, once then matched Ita's exactly. No one spoke of thanks. No one needed to. The act itself was enough for now. Bonito watched from a distance. He stood at the edge of the clearing, arms folded, breath pluming white. Relief sat heavy in his chest. Relief that she breathed, that she moved, that she had not slipped away in the dark. But it came tangled with something tighter, the knowledge that the camp still watched, still measured her worth against the empty pots and the lengthening nights. He saw the sidelong glances when she limped past, the way some of the older women shook their heads, as though waiting for her to prove them right. Then Colt came in wounded. It happened on a gray morning when a small patrol of bluecoats had ridden too close to the hidden trails. The skirmish was brief, ugly rifle cracks echoing off the canyon walls, a horse screaming once before it went down. Colt returned with a shallow gash across his forearm, the kind that looks clean at first, but festers fast. By evening, the skin around it had turned angry red-hot to the touch, and a thin line of red crept up toward his elbow. Fever settled in him like smoke in a closed room. Sage examined the wound, frowned, then looked at Ita. "You learned from me," she said simply. "Now you do it alone." Ita stared at the old woman. Her mouth went dry. She had watched Sage draw poison, seen the steady hands, heard the low chants. But she had never held the knife herself, never been the one whose failure might mean a friend died. She looked across the fire at Bonito. He stood motionless, face unreadable, but his eyes never left her. Ita swallowed. She nodded once. They moved Colt into Sage's lodge. The air inside grew thick with the sharp smell of alcohol from the small flask Sage kept for wounds, the green bitterness of crushed herbs, the sourness of infection. Ita knelt beside him, hands trembling as she cleaned the gash with boiled water. The knife felt heavy foreign in her palm. She hesitated, blade hovering over the swollen flesh. Colt's eyes were glassy with fever. He watched her without speaking. She drew a breath long and shaky, and made the cut. Blood welled up dark and thick. Her stomach lurched, but she kept her hand steady enough to press the poultice yarrow and willow bark, mashed into a paste deep into the wound. She wrapped it tight, fingers clumsy at first, then surer. All night she sat there, changing the dressing when it soaked through, feeding him sips of the bitter tea she had brewed earlier. She did not sleep. She barely breathed. Bonito stayed outside the flap, leaning against a pine trunk, listening to the low sounds from within the soft drip of water, the rustle of hides, Ita's quiet murmurs as she worked. He did not enter. He could not bear to see her fail. He could not bear to see her succeed alone. Dawn came thin and pale. The fever broke. Colt's breathing evened out. The angry red line receded. He opened his eyes clearer now and looked at Ita. She sat slumped against the wall, exhausted face, streaked with soot and sweat hands, stained green from the herbs. She managed a small, tired smile. Colt studied her a long moment. Then he gave a single slow nod, not grand, not grateful, in the loud way men sometimes are. Just acknowledgement. The first time a warrior had looked at her and seen something besides pity. Ita's shoulders sagged. She let her head tip back against the hide wall and closed her eyes. Bonito stepped through the flap at last. The cold rushed in behind him. He crossed the small space in 3 strides, boots soft on the packed earth. He stopped beside her, looked down at her worn face, at the faint curve of her mouth that was almost a smile. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm enough that she felt the warmth through her blanket. "You saved my friend," he said, voice low and rough. Ita opened her eyes. They were glassy with fatigue. She looked up at him, searching his face as though waiting for the moment he would take it back. Her voice cracked. "I didn't want you to lose anyone else." Bonito's hand tightened once, then loosened. He did not speak again. From the far side of the clearing, Iron watched. The old man stood wrapped in his heavy robe, breath fogging the air. His gaze moved from Ita to Bonito, then back again. Something shifted in his expression, not approval, not yet, but the first crack in the stone wall of doubt. He did not speak. He simply turned and walked away, moccasins leaving faint tracks in the new snow. Inside the lodge, the fire popped once, sending a shower of sparks upward. Outside, the wind rose again, sharper now, carrying the faint, far-off smell of wood smoke from another canyon. And somewhere in the distance, a raven called harsh, once then silent. Bonito did not move his hand from her shoulder. Neither did Ita pull away. They sat like that in the thin morning light, while the camp stirred slowly awake around them, waiting for whatever came next. The afternoon turned vicious without warning. One moment the sky was the dull gray of old iron. The next, the wind rose like a living thing, howling down the canyon and driving snow sideways in blinding sheets. Visibility dropped to nothing in minutes. The camp had been quiet, women tending low fires, men checking traps when the first shout cut through the gale. 3 children were missing. They had slipped away earlier, chasing each other among the pines with the careless energy of the young. No one had noticed until the storm hit and the mothers began calling their names. The answers came back empty, swallowed by the white roar. Panic spread fast and quiet. Faces appeared at lodge flaps, eyes wide. Mothers clutched blankets to their chests, mouths open in silent fear. The older warriors moved first, pulling on heavy robes, checking knives and bows. Bonito was already outside, snow clinging to his shoulders, voice calm but carrying over the wind. "Spread out in pairs. Stay in sight of each other. We find them before dark, or we don't find them at all." The search began. Ita stood at the edge of the clearing blanket, wrapped tight around her thin frame. Her bad leg throbbed from the morning's work, a deep, familiar ache that flared hotter in the cold. She watched the men fan out into the storm, dark shapes swallowed almost at once by the swirling white. She knew she was too slow to keep pace. She knew the snow would come up to her thighs in places. She knew every step would hurt. And she knew something else. There was a small cave, not much more than a hollow beneath an overhanging ledge tucked into a narrow side canyon. She had found it months ago while gathering roots alone when the others had moved faster and left her behind. The entrance was low, easy to miss, unless you walked slowly, eyes on the ground. Children lost and frightened would seek shelter like that. They would huddle inside trying to stay warm. She hesitated. If she spoke now, they would ask how she knew. They would look at her limp, at her slow gait, and wonder why someone so useless had wandered so far alone. The whispers would start again, louder this time. And if she was wrong, if the children weren't there, the blame would settle on her like wet snow, heavy and impossible to shake. But 3 children were dying out there. She stepped forward. "Bonito." Her voice was small against the wind, but he heard. He turned Snow, crusting his lashes, eyes sharp. She pointed toward the narrow cleft in the ridge, barely visible through the storm. "The cave there," she said, breath pluming white. "I found it when I gathered last moon. It's sheltered. They'll be inside." The men nearby paused. One of the older warriors snorted softly, half disbelief, half impatience. Bonito did not hesitate. He looked at her a long second, then nodded once. "Show us." They moved out together, Bonito in front, Ita behind him, then the others strung out in a line. The snow was deep, dragging at her legs like hands trying to pull her down. Each step sent pain spiking up her bad leg, hot and bright, until her vision blurred at the edges. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. Bonito slowed without a word, matching her pace. When she stumbled, his hand shot out steady under her elbow, lifting just enough to keep her upright. He did not speak. He did not need to. The wind screamed in their faces, stinging skin raw. Snow packed into every fold of clothing melted against skin, then froze again. They reached the cleft after what felt like hours. The entrance was half buried, a dark slash against the white. Bonito dropped to his knees, swept snow away with gloved hands. Ita leaned against the rock wall, gasping, leg trembling so hard she could barely stand. He looked back at her once, then crawled inside. A moment later, his voice came back muffled but clear. "They're here." The children were curled together in the farthest corner, small bodies pressed against the stone, a tiny fire of twigs smoldering between them. One boy had torn strips from his blanket to feed the flames. Their faces were pale eyes, huge and frightened, but they were alive. The men carried them out one by one, wrapped in robes pressed against chests for warmth. Ita watched tears freezing on her lashes. She did not move to help. She could not. Her strength had gone somewhere else. They turned back toward Camp Children, safe, wind still raging. When they broke through the last drift and the lodges appeared like ghosts in the storm, the people were waiting. Mothers rushed forward with cries that cracked the air. Arms reached blankets opened. The children disappeared into embraces. Iron stepped out from the group robe, heavy with snow. He looked at the children, first alive, shivering safe, then at Ita. His gaze lingered. For the first time it held no pity, only something quieter, heavier. He walked to Bonito, voice low, so only they could hear. "She saved them." Bonito turned. His face was wind-burned eyes, red from cold, and something deeper. He looked at Ita, standing apart, swaying slightly, blanket-clutched tight leg trembling beneath her. Snow clung to her hair like white flowers. He did not speak. He only looked. And in the pause, the wind shifted, carrying a new sound. Faint at first, then clearer, the muffled thud of hooves on frozen ground. Not many. A patrol. American. Close. Too close. Bonito's hand dropped to his knife hilt. Iron's eyes narrowed toward the sound. Ita lifted her head, listening. The storm howled on, but the hoofbeats cut through it, steady, relentless, coming nearer. Bonito met her eyes across the snow. Neither of them moved. The fire at the center of the camp burned low and sullen, that evening flames, licking at the edges of stacked pine logs that popped and hissed in the cold. Snow had stopped falling hours earlier, but the air remained thick with it, crisp biting, carrying the faint metallic taste of winter on every breath. The entire band had gathered in a rough circle around the blaze, drawn by the need for warmth, and the heavier need to talk about what had happened in the storm. Children huddled close to mothers, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. The older women sat with straight backs, hands folded in their laps. The warriors stood or crouched, faces shadowed by the flickering light. No one spoke loudly at first. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, but beneath it ran a current of murmurs, low, insistent, like water moving under ice. Ita sat near the outer edge of the circle, knees drawn up under her blanket, bad leg stretched out stiffly in front of her. She kept her eyes on the flames, but she heard everything. A leader must choose strength. Bonito's choice is weakening us all. 3 children almost lost because we followed a woman who can barely walk. He thinks with his heart instead of his head. That's dangerous. The words came from the older warriors, mostly men whose scars and gray hair gave their voices weight. They did not shout. They did not need to. Each phrase landed like a stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples across the circle. Tessa stood at the far rim, half in shadow. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest blanket, clutched in one fist. Her eyes were red-rimmed, shining wet in the firelight, but no tears fell. She did not look at Bonito. She did not look at Ita. She simply stood there, silent, her presence itself, an accusation that needed no words. Iron sat closest to the fire-leg's crossed heavy robe, draped over his shoulders. He said nothing, but his gaze moved slowly, deliberately from Bonito to Ita and back again. Each time it lingered a fraction longer on her. The shift was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Bonito felt it all. He sat beside Ita, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, but not quite. His hands rested on his knees, fingers loose, but the muscles in his forearms stood out like cords. The warmth of the fire did nothing to loosen the knot in his chest. For the first time he understood, truly understood, that his choice had moved beyond private feeling. It had become a threat to the band itself, to the fragile order that kept them alive through winters like this one. If he stayed silent now, Ita would bear the weight alone, until it crushed her. If he spoke, he risked everything he had earned in blood and years. Ita heard the whispers too. Her hands tightened in the folds of her deerskin dress until the leather creaked and her knuckles showed white. She wanted to shrink smaller, disappear into the snow behind her. But she did not move. She kept her back straight, chin level, even as the heat of shame burned her face. Bonito stood. The motion was slow, deliberate. The murmurs faltered, then died. Every eye turned to him. He stepped closer to the fire boots, crunching the thin crust of snow. The flames lit the scars on his face, the hard line of his jaw. She saved 3 children the rest of you could not find, he said. His voice was low, steady, carrying without effort over the crackle of the fire. She saved Colt when you were ready to bury him. If my honor depends on choosing the woman you all expected, then I don't want that honor. The words hung in the cold air. No one moved. The fire snapped once, sending sparks spiraling upward. Tessa's shoulders stiffened. One of the older warriors shifted beads on his shirt, clicking softly. Iron's gaze lifted, fixed on Bonito's face. Bonito did not look away. Ita stared up at him from where she sat, eyes wide, breath caught. Her fingers loosened in her dress, trembling now for a different reason. Bonito turned, crossed back to her side. He reached down and took her hand, cold, small, still marked by faint scars from the weeks of work. He drew her gently to her feet. She rose slowly, favoring her bad leg, but she stood beside him. Her shoulder brushed his arm. She did not pull away. The circle remained silent. Iron rose, then slowly, joints creaking in the cold. He stepped forward until he stood directly across the fire from them. The flames danced between them, throwing his shadow long across the snow. Words come easy, he said. Voice rough as old stone. Winter isn't finished. Meat is running thin. If she cannot prove her worth to all of us, not just in one storm, then you will have to choose again. He let the words settle. Bonito did not answer. His grip on Ita's hand tightened once, reassuring, possessive, then loosened. He kept his eyes on iron unflinching. The old man held his gaze a long moment longer, then turned and walked back to his place. The circle began to break apart slowly, people drifting toward their lodges, blankets pulled tighter, footsteps muffled in snow. Iita stood beside Bonito, breath shallow. She did not speak. Neither did he. The fire burned lower. From somewhere far down the canyon beyond the reach of the camp's light came the faint smell of smoke on the wind. Not their smoke. Different. Thicker. Carried by a breeze that had shifted from the south. Bonito's head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. Iita felt the change in him, the sudden tension in his arm, the way his fingers flexed once around hers. They stood together in the dying firelight, hands joined, while the wind carried that distant smell closer, slow and deliberate, like a warning no one had yet named. The morning came hard and clear, the kind of dawn that cuts through the haze of exhaustion and lays everything bare. Snow had crusted overnight into a brittle shell that cracked underfoot like thin glass. The canyon air smelled sharp of pine resin frozen solid, and the faint, acrid bite of distant gunpowder carried on a shifting wind. Bonito stood at the rim of the high trail, breath fogging in short bursts, eyes fixed on the far end of the valley. 8, no 10 bluecoats moved in a loose line along the edge of the timber carbons, slung horses picking careful steps through the drifts. They were not charging. Not yet. They were searching. Reading sign. Following the faint tracks the band had left when they carried the children home last night. Half a day's hard ride, maybe less, if the snow held. Behind him the camp stirred into frantic quiet. Mothers bundled children into extra robes. Men checked quivers, tightened bowstrings, sharpened knives against whetstones that sang thin and cold. The whispers had already started among the younger warriors, low, urgent, edged with doubt. If he chose wrong, we won't have the strength to run far. He's put us all at risk for her. Bonito heard them. He did not turn. His jaw tightened once, then eased. There was no time for anger. The band had to move now before the patrol closed the gap and called in more men. But winter had stripped them lean horses, gaunt children weak from thin rations, old ones coughing through the nights. A forced march in deep snow would kill as surely as bullets. He turned back toward the lodges. Iita stood near Sage's wickiup blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, bad leg braced against the cold. She had not slept either. Shadows lay dark under her eyes. When she saw him coming, she straightened through the motion cost her. Bonito stopped in front of her. "We need to scout the back trail," he said, voice low enough for only her to hear. "Find a way out before they cut us off." She nodded slowly. Her fingers tightened on the blanket edge. "I'm going," he continued. "Small party. Fast." Her gaze lifted to his. She understood before he finished. "You want me to stay?" It was not a question. Bonito exhaled through his nose a small plume of white. Leaving her here would be safer for her body, at least. The camp would protect her while he was gone. But it would also leave her alone among people who still weighed her worth in every glance, every empty pot. If he did not return soon, if the whispers grew louder, someone might decide she was the reason the soldiers had come close. They might drive her out, or worse. If he took her, she would slow them. The deep snow would drag at her leg. Every step would be pain. If they were spotted, if it came to running or fighting, she would be the first to fall. He looked at her a long moment, thin face, steady eyes, the faint tremor in her hands she tried to hide. "I want you with me," he said finally. Iita's breath caught. She searched his face, waiting for the hesitation, the regret. It did not come. She nodded once, small, decisive. They left within the hour. Bonito, Jace, 2 other scouts, and Iita. No words wasted. They moved out along the shadowed side of the ridge, keeping low, using the timber to break their outline against the snow. The wind stayed high, masking their footsteps, but it also carried sound farther than they liked. Ita walked last in line, limping but steady. Bonito dropped back twice to check on her. Each time she met his eyes and shook her head no. She was not falling behind. Not yet. They climbed a narrow spur, then dropped into a shallow draw where the snow lay thinner. The scouts fanned out, reading the ground. Bonito crouched beside Ita while they waited. She pointed suddenly quiet, certain toward a tight cleft between two sheer rock faces. There, she said. A game trail. Narrow, but it cut straight through the ridge. I followed it once when the others went the long way. It's hidden unless you know to look slow. The scouts glanced over. One of them, young, impatient, started to speak, then stopped when he saw Bonito's face. Bonito studied the cleft. They were still a quarter-mile out when the arrow came. It hissed past Ita's ear close enough that she felt the air move, then struck a pine trunk with a flat thunk. The shaft quivered, fletching, still trembling. Bonito reacted before thought. He lunged forward, arm sweeping around Ita's waist, driving them both down into the snow. She hit the ground hard, breath knocked out of her. He rolled on top, shielding her body with his own knife already in his hand. "Stay down," he whispered against her ear voice, rough, urgent. She nodded once, face pressed to the cold ground. From the timber below, hoofbeats rose slow at first, then faster. Not a full charge. A probe. Testing. The scouts scattered to cover, bows drawn. Bonito lifted his head just enough to see. The patrol was closing 8 riders' carbines, unslung, now moving deliberately up the slope. He looked down at Ita, eyes wide, breath coming fast, snow clinging to her lashes. He pressed his forehead to hers for half a heartbeat. "No way back now," he whispered. The hoofbeats grew louder. The camp below stirred shouts, the clatter of hurried preparation. Bonito tightened his grip on the knife. The wind carried the smell of horse sweat and oiled metal up the slope, and the riders kept coming. The night swallowed them whole. They moved out as soon as the last light bled from the sky, a thin column of dark shapes threading through the snow-choked canyon. Torches were kept low and shielded small, guttering flames wrapped in wet hides that gave off more smoke than light. The smell of burning pitch and wet wool hung heavy in the cold air, mingling with the sour sweat of fear and the sharp bite of pine. Horses plodded ahead, hooves muffled by the deep drifts pulling travois loaded with what little remained blankets, a few hides, the last scraps of dried meat. Children rode bundled on their mothers' backs, or clung to the sides of the drags, too tired to cry. No one spoke much. The wind did the talking, low moaning, driving snow dust into eyes and mouths. Bonito walked near the middle of the line, one hand on the lead rope of a pack horse, the other steady under Ita's elbow. She limped beside him, breath coming in short, painful bursts. Her bad leg dragged with every step, the knee swollen so tight the joint felt like it might split. She clenched her teeth against the pain-tasting blood where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. She did not ask to stop. She did not complain. The food was nearly gone. A few days, maybe less, if the children kept needing more. Without shelter, without fresh water that wasn't frozen solid, without wood to burn, the cold would finish what hunger had started. Every delay was a death sentence measured in hours. Some of the younger warriors glanced back at Ita as they passed. Their looks were different now, not outright contempt, but a wary calculation. She had found the cave. She had led them through the cleft. She knew things they did not. But she was still slow, still limping, Still the reason the patrol had come so close in the first place. The glances said it plainly, she knows the way. But can she keep up? Bonito felt every one of those looks like a blade against his skin. He slowed his pace without a word matching hers. Each time he did, the gap between them and the people ahead widened. Jace glanced back once, mouth tight, but said nothing. The line stretched thinner. Ita's leg buckled once hard. She staggered, breath hissing out between her teeth. Bonito caught her before she fell, arms strong around her waist. She gripped his sleeve nails, digging in through the hide. "I can go faster," she whispered, voice raw. He looked down at her. Her face was pale, lips blue at the edges, eyes bright with pain, and something fiercer. "No," he said quietly. "You go as you go." She shook her head, stubborn. "If I slow us, they die. If you push too hard, you die." She stared at him a long moment. Then she straightened, pulled her arm free, and took another step. Then another. Teeth gritted, tears freezing on her lashes. She kept moving. They marched through the dark hours. The torches burned down to stubs replaced one by one. The wind never let up. Snow sifted into collars, melted against skin, then froze again into icy crusts. Near what must have been midnight, the column halted in a shallow draw. Bonito called a brief rest, 10 minutes, no more. People dropped to their knees in the snow, gasping, rubbing numb hands. Mothers fed children tiny pieces of jerky. The horses stood with heads low, sides heaving. Ita sank to one knee beside a rock outcrop, breath ragged. Bonito crouched next to her, hand on her back. She looked up, eyes searching the dark ahead. She pointed slow, certain, toward a narrow cleft barely visible in the moonlight. "There," she said, voice hoarse but steady. "A small spring. I found it gathering roots last fall. The water runs under the rock. It doesn't freeze." Bonito followed her finger. The cleft was tight screened by scrub and shadow. He would have missed it. Most would. He turned to Iron, who had come up behind them, silent as stone. "She knows," Bonito said simply. Iron studied the cleft, then Ita. His old eyes narrowed, measuring. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gave one slow nod, deliberate, public. "She knows." The words carried, heads turned. A few of the younger warriors exchanged glances. The murmurs quieted. Bonito helped Ita to her feet. She leaned on him a moment, then stepped forward. The line reformed. They moved toward the cleft. But before they reached it, the night cracked open. A rifle shot, sharp, flat, unmistakable. Not a stray. Deliberate, from behind. Another followed. Closer. The horses shied. A woman cried out. Children whimpered. Bonito spun, knife already in hand. The patrol had found them, closing fast now, no longer searching. Hunting. He turned back to Ita. Her face was pale in the torchlight, eyes wide, but she did not run. She stood breathing hard, hand reaching for his. He took it. Squeezed once. "We have to run," he said, voice low, rough. "Together." She nodded, small, fierce. He pulled her close for half a heartbeat, then released her. They turned and moved with the others toward the cleft torches, guttering snow swirling. The night closed around them, but behind the hoofbeats rose steady, relentless pounding through the dark like a second heartbeat, and the rifles kept speaking. The cleft opened into a narrow basin ringed by sheer rock walls, the kind of place the wind forgot. A small spring cut through the center clear water, threading over smooth stones too deep and too fast to freeze solid. It ran with a soft, constant murmur that seemed almost too gentle for the night they had just survived. Snow lay thin here, wind scoured, and the rock faces held back the worst of the cold. They reached it just before false dawn. The band moved in exhausted silence. Horses were unsaddled with numb fingers. Travois unloaded wickiup frames raised in haste poles, lashed with rawhide hides stretched taut against the wind. Fires were kindled quickly, small and shielded, fed with whatever dry wood could be broken from the lower branches. The smell of smoke rose sharp and welcome, mingling with the mineral tang of wet stone and the faint earthy scent of thawing ground near the spring. People drank first cupping hands, children kneeling at the edge, mothers holding infants so they could lap the cold water. No one wasted breath on thanks. Survival did not require words. Ita sat near one of the new fires, back against a boulder, bad leg stretched out straight. The night's march had left her drained. Her face was pale, lips cracked, hands shaking as she worked. She had gathered what she could on the way, roots pried from under snow strips of inner bark peeled from young aspens. Now she ground them between two flat stones, the slow scrape steady despite the tremor in her fingers. The paste would stretch what little food remained, add what small nourishment the body could still take. She portioned it out first to the children, small handfuls pressed into their palms, mixed with water into a thin gruel. They ate without question, eyes too big, too quiet. Only after every child had taken a share did she measure a portion for the old ones, then the women. Herself last. Bonito watched her from across the small fire. He had not sat. He stood, arms folded, eyes moving over the camp, counting heads, noting who limped, who coughed. The food they carried would last 2 days, 3 if they rationed hard. No game sign in this basin, no tracks. Oh, if they stayed too long, hunger would weaken them further. If they moved again soon, the weakest would fall behind. A few of the younger warriors lingered near the spring-filling water skins. They glanced at Ita, quick looks, not hostile now, but uncertain. She had led them here. The spring had saved them from thirst, but she was still slow, still limping. If the bluecoats pressed harder, if they had to run again, could she keep up? The glances said it without words. Gratitude, yes, but doubt, too. The distant gunfire had not stopped. It came in faint, sporadic pops, echoes rolling down the canyon like thunder that refused to fade. The patrol was still out there, still searching. Bonito crossed to Ita. He crouched beside her close enough that his shadow fell over the stones she worked. She looked up, hands pausing. Her eyes were red-rimmed exhaustion carving hollows under them. She held out a small twist of ground root and bark, enough for one person. He took it, looked at the meager portion in his palm. Then he broke it in half and pressed one piece back into her hand. "You need to live too," he said quietly. Her fingers closed around it. She stared at the food a long moment, throat working. Then she nodded, small, once eyes bright, with something that might have been tears if she had any left. She ate slowly. He did the same. Around them, the camp settled into an uneasy hush. Fires burned low. Mothers hummed soft songs to restless children. The spring kept its steady murmur. The wind rose and fell, carrying the far-off smell of pine smoke and something else. Gun oil, horse sweat, men who did not sleep. Dawn came thin and pale light, filtering through high clouds that promised more snow. Jace returned from the ridge lookout, breath-heaving snow crusted on his lashes and the front of his robe. He went straight to Bonito. "They're splitting up," he said, voice low, urgent. "Main group holding the lower trail. Small party 6, maybe 7, circling west. They're coming through this cut. They know we're close." Bonito straightened. His gaze moved over the camp, the huddled forms, the thin fires, the children still sleeping against their mothers. Then it settled on Ita. She had heard. She met his eyes steady, afraid, but not running. He looked back at the basin, at the narrow exit ahead, at the ridge behind them, where the hoofbeats would soon echo. No time left to wait. He reached down, offered his hand. Ita took it. Her fingers were cold, but they closed around his without hesitation. The camp began to stir, quiet, urgent, no wasted motion. The spring kept running soft and indifferent, and from the far ridge, faint but growing clearer, came the first muffled thud of hooves on frozen ground. Bonito helped Ita to her feet. She leaned on him a moment, then straightened as best she could. They turned toward the others. No one spoke. The wind carried the sound closer. The afternoon light was thin and slanting, the kind that turns snow into a blinding sheet of white and makes every shadow look like a threat. The basin still held a fragile quiet, but it was the quiet of people who know the silence won't last. Children sat listless against lodge walls, cheeks, hollow eyes too large. An old woman coughed wet and ragged into her blanket, the sound cutting through the murmur of preparation. Horses stamped restlessly, breath pluming white. The band moved with the slow urgency of those who have run before and know the cost of delay. Ita sat near a small fire, at the edge of the camp, knees drawn up under her blanket, back braced against a fallen log. The flames were low, fed with twigs and dry grass enough to heat a small pot of water without sending too much smoke. She worked steadily, grinding roots between two flat stones, the scrape rhythmic and deliberate. Her hands were steady now, the tremor of exhaustion replaced by something quieter focus. She added strips of inner bark to the paste, pale, fibrous bitter, and stirred it into the boiling water. The smell rose sharp and medicinal, cutting through the cold. She no longer rushed. She no longer tried to prove her body could keep up. What she offered now was the knowledge she had gathered in all the times she had been left behind. Slow walks, careful eyes, the patience of someone who had to notice what others missed. A shadow fell across her work. She looked up. Tessa stood there, blanket clutched in one hand, face half hidden by the hood of her robe. For a long moment neither spoke. Tessa's eyes were still red from the night before, but the anger had burned down to something else, something uncertain. She did not sit at first. She simply watched Ita's hands move. Then, without a word, Tessa lowered herself to the ground beside her. She picked up a spare stone and began to crush a fresh piece of root mirroring Ita's motions. The two stones scraped in uneven rhythm at first, then fell into step. No explanation, no apology, just the quiet work. Ita did not look at her. She kept grinding, but her shoulders eased a fraction. The pot bubbled softly. Ita ladled a small portion into a wooden bowl and passed it to a nearby child, skinny legs shivering. The boy took it with both hands, drank slowly, eyes closing in relief. Ita watched him a moment, then turned back to the pot. She stood then, slow, careful, using a stout stick for support. Her bad leg protested with a deep, grinding ache that made her breath hitch. She did not let it show. She limped toward a cluster of young aspens at the basin's edge stick, punching through the snow with each step. The pain was constant now, a hot wire running from hip to ankle, but she kept moving. She peeled more bark, gathered roots half buried under drifts, carried them back in the crook of her arm. When she returned, Tessa was still there. So were two other women, older, quieter, drawn by the smell or the sight of something useful being made. They knelt without being asked, hands joining the work. Ita sat again. She took a breath, then spoke, voice low but clear enough to carry over the fire. "This bark," she said, holding up a strip, "if you boil it with the root, it feeds a person through 3 days without meat. It's not much, but it keeps the blood moving, keeps the weakness from settling too deep. I learned it because I walk slow, and I have to look close." She met their eyes, one by one. No pride. Just truth. Tessa paused, stone still in her hand. She looked at the bark, then at Ita. Something shifted in her face, small, almost invisible. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words were simple, rough from disuse, but they landed like stones in still water. The other women echoed it, soft murmurs, nods. No grand speeches. Just acknowledgement. Ita looked down at her hand, stained green, cracked from cold, and kept working. The camp finished packing. Horses were loaded. Children tied to travois. The fires were smothered. Snow kicked over the coals. The band formed up a thin line, ready to move. Bonito walked beside Ita as they started forward. He matched her pace without comment, arm ready if she needed it. The snow was deep again, dragging at every step. Her leg burned, but she kept going. He leaned close, voice low against the wind. "You're saving us," he said. She did not answer at first. She only kept moving stick, punching the snow breath, pluming white. Then she glanced at him, eyes tired but steady. "I'm trying," she whispered. They walked on, but before they had cleared the basin's mouth, the shot came. A single rifle crack sharp close echoed off the rock walls. Snow exploded beside Ita's foot. An arrow followed steel-tipped, fletched in blue, thudding into the drift inches from her boot. The shaft quivered black against white. Ita froze. Bonito's arm swept around her waist, pulling her down behind a boulder. His body shielded hers, knife already drawn. The camp scattered mothers shielding children, warriors dropping to cover bows coming up. Another shot rang out, higher, wilder. The patrol had found them again. Bonito pressed his back to the rock, Ita against his chest. Her breath came fast, shallow. His hand tightened on her shoulder once, then loosened. He looked out toward the ridge. Shadows moved there, dark against snow closing. He looked down at her. She met his eyes, afraid, yes, but not running. The wind carried the smell of powder smoke, now bitter close. And the hoofbeats started again, louder, faster, no longer searching. Bonito's jaw tightened. They were out of time. The night settled over the thin forest like a heavy robe, the pines standing sparse and black against a sky without stars. The band had stopped in a shallow hollow where the trees broke the wind just enough to breathe. No large fires, only small ones dug into shallow pits, and ringed with stones their flames kept low, and fed with dried twigs that snapped like bones. The smell of pine resin and damp earth rose from the ground, undercut by the faint, sour odor of unwashed bodies and fear sweat. Horses stood tethered in a tight group, heads low, ears flicking at every distant sound. Iron had chosen the spot for council deliberately, far enough from the main camp that voices would not carry close enough that the glow of the small fire could still be seen by those waiting. He sat on a fallen log robe, draped heavy across his shoulders, face carved by firelight into deep lines of age and decision. The other elders flanked him. 3 men whose hair was more gray than black, whose scars told stories older than most of the band. Bonito sat opposite, knees drawn up, hands resting on them. His back was straight, but his fingers were laced tight enough that the knuckles showed white. No one spoke for a long time. The fire popped once, sending a spark upward into the dark. Somewhere beyond the trees, a horse snorted uneasy. Iron leaned forward at last. His voice came low, rough from years of smoke and command. "They're closing the circle," he said. "A few hours, maybe less. We can't run forever. Not like this." The words hung between them. Bonito did not flinch. He had felt the noose tightening since the first distant shot. Iron's eyes never left his face. If your choice doesn't save the band, if she can't prove she's worth more than the trouble she brings, then you'll have to let her go. To keep the rest of us alive. The elders shifted small movements, leather creaking. One coughed once into his fist. Bonito felt the words land like a blade between his ribs, not sudden, not clean, just deep and twisting slow. His hands tightened until the tendons stood out. He stared into the fire, the flames reflected in his eyes, small and steady. He thought of Ita out there in the dark, sitting near one of the low fires, heavy with child, now the swell of her belly visible even under the blanket. The band knew. They had seen her slow steps, her careful hands on her stomach when she thought no one watched. They knew what was coming. He could agree. He could nod promise to consider it, by time, protect the band by sacrificing what mattered most to him. It would be the practical thing, the leader's thing. But the thought of turning from her, of leaving her to face the whispers, the cold, the birth alone, twisted harder than any knife. He lifted his head. "I chose her with my heart," he said quietly. The words came out rough but clear. "Now that heart has to save the band, or it will kill us all." Iron watched him. The old man's face did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of it. Bonito continued, voice low but steady. "I didn't choose her to save the band. I chose her to save myself. But if she can save everyone, that's what I want most." The silence that followed was thicker than the night. One of the elders exhaled through his nose, a sound that might have been approval or resignation. Iron held Bonito's gaze a long time. Then he nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then let her prove it. He rose, joints creaking in the cold. The other elders stood with him. They walked away without another word, robes trailing in the snow, leaving Bonito alone by the fire. He did not move at once. He stared into the flames until his eyes burned. Then he stood slow and walked back toward the main camp. Ita sat near one of the shielded fire's blanket, wrapped tight around her shoulders and the swell of her belly. The light caught on her face, pale, tired, but calm in a way it had not been before. She looked up as he approached. She did not smile. She simply waited. He stopped a few paces away, watching her. The firelight played across her features, softening the lines of exhaustion. Behind her, the camp moved in quiet preparation. Mothers settling children, men checking weapons, horses shifting restlessly. Bonito's throat tightened. He took one step closer. Then the night split. A rifle shot sharp close cracked through the trees. Not distant anymore. Not probing. Deliberate. Voices followed harsh white man shouts carrying on the wind. Orders. Movement. Another shot. Closer. The camp froze for half a heartbeat. Then it erupted, quiet panic, mothers pulling children close, warriors rising with bows and knives, horses snorting and pulling at ropes. Bonito turned toward the sound. His hand went to his knife hilt. He looked back at Ita. She had not moved. She sat there, hands on her belly, eyes fixed on him. No fear in her face, now only something steady, something that had been forged in the long nights and the slow steps. He crossed the distance in 3 strides. He knelt beside her hand, covering hers on the swell of her stomach. The shouts grew louder. Hooves thudded, many now crashing through the underbrush. Bonito's eyes met hers. His voice was low, rough, meant for her alone. "They're here." She nodded once, small, certain. Outside the circle of firelight, the darkness pressed in. The shots came faster. The band rose as one. Bonito stood. He offered his hand. Ita took it. And the night filled with the sound of men closing in. The storm hit like a judgment. It came without mercy, without warning, a wall of white fury slamming down from the high ridges, turning the narrow valley into a churning void. Snow drove sideways in blinding sheets, the wind screaming through the pines like a wounded animal. Visibility dropped to arm's length, then less. The band had pushed into this trap of a place at midday, hoping the sheer walls would shield them from the patrol. Now those walls trapped them, funneling the gale into a howl that tore at robes and skin alike. The air smelled of ice and pine sap, and the faint coppery tang of blood already spilled. They were cornered. The bluecoats had circled wide, 12-15 strong horses laboring through the drifts, but closing the single escape trail at the valley's mouth. Bonito had seen them first from a rocky outcrop, dark shapes materializing out of the white like ghosts. No time to flank, no time to slip away. The storm had done the soldiers' work for them. The band huddled in a ragged cluster against the valley wall, women pressing children, close elders wrapped in every scrap of hide they owned. Fires were impossible. The wind snuffed every spark. The children whimpered not from fear alone, but from the gnawing hollow in their bellies. Food had run out yesterday, last handfuls of bark paste scraped from bowls gone before the storm broke. Now hunger twisted their small faces, and the cold clawed deeper. Ita leaned against a boulder, one hand braced on the swell of her belly, the other clutching her blanket like a lifeline. The baby moved inside her heavy insistent, as if sensing the chaos. She was close now, too close. Every contraction from the cold or the fear made her breath hitch. She could not run, not fast, not far. In this white hell, she would be the anchor dragging them all down. Bonito stood at the edge of the group, snow crusting his lashes knife in one hand, bow in the other. Colt and Jace flanked him, faces grim arrows knocked. The young warriors behind them shifted uneasily, eyes darting to the white void. The first volley came without warning, a ragged crackle of rifles splitting the gale. Bullets whined off rock, thudded into snow. One caught a young warrior in the chest, barely more than a boy, eyes wide as he staggered, then dropped. He hit the drift face first, blood blooming dark against the white, steaming faintly, before the wind tore it away. His mother wailed once, short, broken, then clamped her hand over her mouth. Bonito did not flinch, but inside something cracked. This was his doing, his choice. The woman he had claimed, the life growing in her, these had drawn the eyes, the pursuit, the trap. Now the band paid in blood and frostbite, and the slow death of starvation. He felt it like a weight on his chest, heavier than the storm. He turned to Colt and Jace. "Small group," he said, voice cutting through the wind. "We draw them. Buy time for the rest to slip the back trail." Colt nodded once, jaw tight. Jace met his eyes longer, searching, then gripped his shoulder hard. "Go with them," Bonito said to the women gathered near. "Through the cleft. Sage knows it." Eyes turned to him, fear, accusation, resignation. Ita pushed forward, blanket slipping from one shoulder, face pale but set. She gripped his arm, fingers digging in. "No," she said, voice thin against the howl. "Not without you." He looked down at her, really looked. The swell of her belly, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her free hand rested protectively over the child. Nash. The name he had whispered to her in quieter nights when the future still seemed possible. He cupped her face with one gloved hand, rough leather against her cold skin. His thumb brushed her cheek, tracing the line of a tear frozen there. "Run," he said. "For Nash." Tears spilled fresh, now hot against the cold, freezing on her lashes. She shook her head, gripping his wrist like she could anchor him there. "Don't leave me alone." He swallowed hard, throat burning. The wind tore at his words. "She'll live," he said, nodding toward Tessa, who stood nearby, face drawn but steady. "And she'll teach Nash to see." Ita's breath hitched a sob, swallowed by the gale. She leaned into his hand for one heartbeat, then let go. Sage and Tessa moved in arms around her waist, pulling her back toward the shadowed cleft. Ita resisted once, small desperate, then went. Her eyes stayed on him until the snow swallowed her shape. Bonito turned away. The pain was immediate, a hollow ache deeper than any wound. But there was no time. He signaled Colt and Jace. 4 more warriors joined them, hardmen silent. They slipped out into the storm boughs, low knives ready. The wind masked their steps, but not the cold that numbed fingers and toes. They moved parallel to the patrol's line, using the white for cover. Bonito's shoulder burned where a stray shot had grazed him earlier, bullet tearing hide and flesh, blood soaking warm before freezing stiff. Each twist sent fire lancing down his arm, but he ignored it. Pain was just another debt to pay. The bluecoats fired again, scattered shots probing. One whistled past Bonito's ear close enough to sing. He dropped to one knee, knocked an arrow, loosed it into the white. A horse screamed somewhere ahead, high panicked. A man shouted. They closed. Bonito's group broke into the open, then dark shapes against white arrows flying. The soldiers wheeled carbines, barking. Lead whined. Snow exploded around them. Bonito fired again, steady, deliberate, then ducked as return fire chewed the drift beside him. A bullet clipped his shoulder, reopening the graze. Blood welled hot, soaking his sleeve, but he stood. Shouted. Drew their eyes. Behind them, the band slipped away, women, children, elders toward the cleft. Ita lashed Tessa's arm around her, Sage urging from behind. Bonito risked one glance back. Her shape was a blur in the storm, small, determined, vanishing into white. Then he turned forward. The rifles thundered. The wind howled louder. Ita stumbled once as Tessa pulled her deeper into the cleft hand, pressing her belly against the first sharp pain. She twisted, looking back over her shoulder. Bonito was gone, swallowed by the storm, by the fight, by the choice that had bound them and now tore them apart. The gunfire echoed, fading ragged, until only the wind remained, raking the empty valley like claws on bone. She did not cry out. She only walked on one hand and Tessa's the other on her child, while the snow buried their tracks and the night pressed close. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it hurt the ears. The band, what remained of it, had crawled into a long, narrow cave, high on the border ridge, a place carved by ancient water and forgotten by time. The entrance was low, forcing grown men to duck, but inside the chamber opened wide enough for 20 huddled souls. The rock walls wept cold moisture. The floor was uneven stone covered with whatever hides and blankets they still possessed. A single fire burned near the back, fed with splintered branches, scavenged from the timber line. Its light barely reached the entrance, throwing long shadows that danced like ghosts. The air smelled of wet stone, smoke blood, and the faint sour milk of exhaustion. They were fewer now. Perhaps 2/3 of the faces that had fled the valley remained. The rest lay somewhere under snow, old ones who could not keep pace, a mother and her infant lost in a drift, young warriors cut down in the rearguard fight. No one spoke their names aloud. Grief had become another weight they carried in silence. Ita lay on a thick bed of hides near the fire, knees drawn up as far as her swollen belly allowed. The pains had started in the night, sharp, relentless, coming faster than anyone expected. Sage and Tessa knelt on either side of her. Sage's hands were steady, pressing a damp cloth to Ita's forehead. Tessa held her hand knuckles white with the force of Ita's grip. The other women formed a quiet circle, murmuring low chants, or simply breathing with her. No one pretended this would be easy. The labor stretched through the long hours. Ita's cries were low, choked, more animal than human, swallowed by the cave walls. Sweat soaked her hair, her blanket the hides beneath her. Blood came in dark rushes. Sage worked quickly, packing moss and clean strips of hide to stem it. Ita's body shook with each contraction, her bad leg trembling uncontrollably, the old injury screaming under the strain. She bit down on a folded strip of leather until her teeth ached. Sage leaned close, voice calm but urgent. "Push now, girl. He's coming." Ita's head fell back. Tears tracked down her temples into her hair. She thought of Bonito, his last look, the way his hand had pressed to her belly, the promise he had not spoken. She thought of the storm swallowing him, the rifles barking, the silence that followed. She thought he was gone. And still she pushed because the child inside her demanded it, because she had no choice left. The baby came in a rush of blood and fluid, and a cry that split the cave like a blade. Small, red, furious. Sage lifted him quickly, wiped him with a soft hide, wrapped him in the warmest blanket they had left. Tessa cut the cord with a sharp knife hands, shaking only a little. Ita collapsed back, breath-ragged body limp. Blood still pooled beneath her. Sage pressed hard, murmuring to the others for more cloth. Ita's vision blurred. The pain was everywhere, deep in her belly, sharp in her leg, dull in her chest. She felt herself slipping the cave, tilting the fire, dimming. She thought with strange calm that this might be the end. But the child's cry anchored her. She reached out, weak, trembling, and Sage placed the tiny bundle in her arms. He was warm, alive. His small fists waved, face scrunched in outrage at the cold world he had entered. Ita looked down at him through tears. She touched his cheek, soft, impossibly soft, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not grief alone, not hope alone. Something heavier, truer. She lived. But the cost was carved into her. The bleeding had been too much. Her body felt hollow, fragile. Her leg, already twisted, would never straighten fully again. The strength she had scraped together through the winter was gone, spent in that one desperate night. She would walk slower, tire faster, ache deeper forever. There would be no returning to what she had been. The cave was quiet now, except for the baby's soft hiccups and the crackle of the fire. The women watched, some with tears, some with the blank exhaustion of those who have seen too much death and too little birth. Iron appeared at the entrance, silhouette, dark against the pale daylight outside. He had been sitting alone on a ledge, staring into the white distance. Now he stepped inside, robe heavy with snow boots, leaving wet prints on the stone. He crossed to Ita, without hurry, knelt stiffly beside her. He looked at the child, small, dark-haired eyes already open and searching. Then he looked at Ita. Her face was pale, slick with sweat, but her eyes met his without flinching. Iron reached out one gnarled hand and touched the baby's forehead, gentle, almost reverent. "He will be called Nash," he said, voice low and rough. "The one who sees." Ita's breath caught. Tears slipped free again, tracking down her cheeks. "Because his father saw me," she whispered. Iron held her gaze a long moment, then he nodded once slow. Outside the cave, the wind had dropped to a low moan. The snow lay thick and unbroken. No hoofbeats, no rifle cracks. Only silence. Then, faint at first, growing steadier, the sound of a single horse moving through the drifts. The women froze. Iron rose, slowly, hand on his knife. Ita clutched Nash tighter, heart hammering against her ribs. A shadow filled the entrance, tall, limping cloak, torn and dark with dried blood. The figure ducked under the low overhang and stepped into the firelight. Bonito. His face was gaunt, one shoulder wrapped in a blood-soaked rag that had frozen stiff. His left arm hung limp. Snow clung to his hair, his lashes, his beard. He looked older, hollowed out, but alive. He saw Ita first, then the bundle in her arms. He crossed the cave in 3 uneven strides, dropped to his knees beside her. No words. None were possible. He reached out, slow, trembling, and gathered them both into his arms. Ita against his chest, Nash cradled between them. His breath shuddered out in a sound that might have been a sob or a prayer. The cave held its breath. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind rose again, low, restless, carrying the promise of more snow. And somewhere far off, faint as memory, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the ridges. Whether storm or gunfire, no one could yet tell. The first spring came slow and tentative, like a promise no one quite trusted. The hidden valley lay tucked between two low ridges, far enough from the main trails that the snow lingered in the shadows, long after the sun had burned the high places clean. Green shoots pushed through the thinning, white, stubborn, thin blades of grass, the pale tips of wild onion, the first cottonwood leaves trembling in the breeze. The air smelled different now, wet earth, new sap, the faint, sweet rot of last year's leaves thawing underfoot. No longer the sharp bite of winter death, but something alive, uncertain. The band had settled here out of necessity, not choice. They were smaller, too small. Lodges stood in a loose half-circle near a narrow creek, frames patched with whatever hides remained. Fires burned low during the day, higher at night, their smoke rising thin and careful. No one spoke of the numbers lost. The graves were simple, small mounds of stones under the pines, unmarked, so the soldiers would not find them. The children played quieter now, their laughter short, and quickly hushed. Bonito sat outside their lodge in the late afternoon light, back against a sun-warmed rock. His left shoulder was still wrapped in a strip of hide. The wound had closed, but the joint moved stiff and weak. He could no longer draw a bow to full pull. His knife hand was steady, but the old strength, the easy power that had once made men step aside, was gone. He accepted it the way a man accepts a missing finger. It was part of him now, a reminder of what he had spent. Nash lay on a soft blanket across his lap, small fists waving, dark eyes fixed on his father's face. The boy was strong, stronger than the winter should have allowed his cries, healthy, demanding. Bonito cradled him carefully, one large hand supporting the tiny head. He spoke low words meant for the child, but carried on the breeze. "Your mother taught me how to see," he said, voice rough from disuse. She walked slow so she noticed what the rest of us missed. And I chose her when the whole world said I shouldn't. Nash gurgled, small hand, reaching up to touch Bonito's scarred cheek. Bonito caught the fingers, gently kissed them once. Ita sat beside them on a folded robe, legs stretched out, bad leg propped on a rolled blanket. The limp was heavier now, the joint stiff even on warm days. She tired faster, slept longer, and the old fever had left her thinner, more fragile. But she worked still quietly, steadily. She taught the women and the older children which roots eased pain, which barks stretched thin meals, which leaves stopped bleeding. They came to her now without hesitation, bringing small bundles of plants, asking questions in low voices. She answered without pride, without hurry. The knowledge had become theirs, not hers alone. She reached over and brushed a strand of hair from Nash's forehead. Her fingers lingered. Bonito covered her hand with his. They did not speak of what was lost, the freedom to move without fear, the full strength of Bonito's arm, the lightness Ita had once carried in her step. A piece of the band's respect whispers still drifted sometimes quiet questions about the dangerous choice. But they had each other. They had Nash, and that was enough to keep breathing. Iron stood a few paces away near the creek's edge. He had not spoken much since the birth. He watched them now, the three of them framed by the low fire, the child between the man and woman joined by hands and silence. His face was unreadable, carved deep by years and weather. He was the last witness, the one who would carry the memory when the others forgot or died. He studied them a long moment, Bonito's scarred shoulder, Ita's careful posture, the baby's small, perfect hands, then turned away. He walked slowly toward the ridge robe, trailing back, straight but heavy. The sun dropped lower. The valley filled with long shadows. A breeze moved through the new leaves, carrying the first true bird song, high, thin, hesitant. It rose and fell, then rose again. Bonito looked at Ita. Her eyes were on Nash, soft with something that had survived the winter. "We made it through," he said quietly. She lifted her gaze to his. Her voice was low, almost lost in the wind. "But we lost so much." He nodded once, slow, certain. "And we found each other." The words hung between them, simple, unadorned. No promises, no grand vows, just truth. Ita leaned her head against his good shoulder. Nash stirred small mouth opening in a yawn, then settled again. The fire crackled softly. The creek murmured over stones. Iron paused at the ridge crest silhouetted against the fading light. He looked back, once long, steady, then disappeared over the rise. The wind moved through the valley again, gentle now, carrying the scent of green things waking. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, sharp, distant, alive. Bonito tightened his arm around Ita. She rested her hand over his. The light dimmed. The wind kept blowing, soft, persistent, never quite stopping. And in the quiet that followed, the valley held them all, scarred, smaller, still breathing. The story did not end with triumph. It simply continued, quiet, imperfect, real, into whatever came next. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process, but every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this.